Hey there, it's Dr. Karen, and today I wanted to share a couple examples of some leadership and advocacy initiatives that I was able to do when I was in the school systems that really had an impact on the way that I serve my clients. And I wanted to share these two examples because they happened early on when I was practicing, and they seem kind of small and insignificant, or they at least did to me at the time, but really taking these steps was big for me because it made me realize that I could have an impact on the way that things were done in my facility. And I realized that if I could change that I could potentially make bigger changes in the field, like I'm doing right now with training SLPs and teaching them to rework their language therapy protocols. So just these little changes started to help me to think bigger about how I could make an impact. And it also made me rethink the level of influence that I have. Because as a SLPs, I know that a lot of times people feel like they don't have any control over how they serve their clients. And they feel like things are just forced upon them. Their administrators tell them rules and things that they need to follow, and they have no way of changing the way that they're showing up for their clients. It gets frustrating to wait for changes to come from the top because they take a really long time. And we have clients on our caseloads now. We know that changes that come at the policy level are going to take years and years to happen, if they ever happen. And so it's frustrating when we are trying to speak up for changes and they're not happening fast enough for the people that we are serving right now. So all of the clients and students on our caseload at the present time. So that can be very frustrating. So I wanted to share two wins that I had early on in my career that really made me think differently about the impact that I had. So I kind of operated, kind of shifted my mindset early on from kind of a ask for forgiveness rather than permission at the very beginning. Part of that was because when I went back and got my doctorate, my first thing was that I really wanted to specialize in language therapy. And as I started to dig into some of those protocols, I started to learn things about RTI, because if you're thinking about reading in the school systems and literacy, you have to think not just about what you're actually doing in therapy, you also have to think about what's going on from a procedural level at your facility, because it all works together. All of the things that the other teachers were doing and all the different rules that we had as far as how we had to move students through the process of getting evaluated for services, that had an impact as well. So I couldn't just focus on what I was doing in therapy and what was evidence-based practice. I had to also think about all those procedural things. And as somebody who had expertise in language and literacy, it was really important for me to be sharing that information with other people, because when I initially started out, my first couple of years in the school systems, we had these problem-solving teams at our buildings where they would field all the referrals for special ed, and the speech pathologist wasn't on the team. And so a lot of times they would make these decisions without our input, and as a result, kids would fall through the cracks and things just weren't done the way that they should have been. And we would have been able to create some changes in the way that things were done had we have been on that team. So the very first thing that we did as an SLP department, it was me and two other SLPs. One of the very first changes that we made was simply getting on that team. And so that was, again, seems like kind of a little thing. We got to go to another committee meeting, not always people's favorite thing to do, but that was one of the very first things that we did that started that process of us being involved. So that meant that when a student went through a special education evaluation, we got to be there and we got to see what happened. So as I joined that team, I number one, started to learn about the way that things were done in my facility. And number two, started to realize where there was room for improvement. And I'm definitely not saying that they were doing everything wrong or trying to rip on the place that I used to work. And, it was fantastic. But of course, they didn't know things from my end. So there were definitely changes that needed to be made as far as making speech and language referrals. So that was the very first step. So again, that alone is something small that I was able to do in order to make that change. And so we did that as an SLP department. The three of us that were there were able to talk to our administrators and get them to agree to us being on the team. One of the other things that we did that helped to move that along was not just build a relationship with the building principal, but also build a relationship with the school social worker and the psychologist. They were already on that team. So I think they definitely put in a good word for our department with the administrators so that we could get in on that process. So that's another tip for you. Make friends with your psychologist and social worker and other people who are on that team. So that was the first thing. And then as I got on that team, there were a couple of things that I noticed that were causing some bottlenecks and some issues as far as service delivery, because sometimes when people are in an administrative position, they don't always realize how the decisions that they're making are affecting things further down the line. So one of the very first things and one of the very first changes that we made was due to the fact that there were students who were getting there were a number of issues with the way that students were being evaluated for when they had a speech and language disorder versus when they had a specific learning disability. So there were a lot of students who would they would go through the process. And again, initially we weren't involved at all. So they would have this full special education evaluation done, and they would not necessarily qualify for services under specific learning disability. And so people would try to get them in the back door and say, okay, well, this student doesn't qualify as specific learning disability. Can they qualify for speech? And they try to get them in the back door that way and get them essentially get them a speech and language IEP, and then they would just have a speech and language IEP. And then people would kind of think, oh, they have an IEP. Well, everything is fixed because they have an IEP now. And the IEP would just be, they're getting language therapy for 30 minutes a week. And it was placed 100% on the SLP to provide those special ed services without any other team members. And so the fact that we were evaluating separately was not good. So that was one of the very first things that we fixed, was that whenever a student had an academic issue or any kind of academic referral, was that the speech pathologist and the psychologist would have to, and actually the social worker as well, and the whole team would look at them as, kind of as a big picture and figure out what exactly do we need to evaluate here. And so we would look at the child holistically and look at all of the different areas instead of doing one evaluation over here and doing one evaluation over here. And then the second thing that would happen when we did it that way was, if a child did not qualify specific learning disability, but they did qualify for me, and maybe they did only qualify for 30 minutes a week for speech, what we would do is that the psychologist, because we did the evaluation together, that student was not dropped from their radar. And so every time they were due for a reevaluation, we would look at all of the different areas again, and that prevented students from just going through their whole school experience without ever being reconsidered to see if there's something else going on, because a lot of students would only qualify for speech in the early years, and then they would, just kind of stay and move along through the process with a speech and language IEP and never get picked up for anything else, when when truly they sometimes needed it. So that whole process of making it a team effort made a huge difference. And I know, again, like it started with just one decision of us being on the committee, and that just facilitated this whole process. Another thing that came up that I will share really quickly was that a lot of students were over the summer, we were considering students to see if they needed extended school year services, and kind of the same thing was happening. It was, all right, we're just gonna, bypass this whole process. We're not gonna, refer anybody, but maybe they'll qualify for speech. And so the only thing that these students who had these really severe needs were getting over the summer was speech. And sometimes that was appropriate, but sometimes it wasn't. So at that time, I was going through my special ed law class during my doctoral program, and I actually had access to one of the other administrators who was a special ed director, and I was able to kind of finagle a process of and kind of figure out what the laws were. And what we did was I created this checklist to determine which kids would qualify for extended school year criteria. And I went around and shared it with all the special ed teachers of the classrooms that I served. And we started using that process and using that protocol to collect data so that we could consider the students for extended school year across the board. And so what ended up happening was that there was a whole group of students for their elementary years that got to go to an extended school year program, not just 30 minutes a week of speech, but a 4-day-a-week morning program. They were able to go and get services during their elementary years. Now, eventually we had to pull back on that, and students didn't qualify for that anymore when they got to the secondary level, but that was their elementary years that they got to take advantage of that program. And again, it all started with me being involved in the process and me taking initiative to start talking to my coworkers and creating some change, because we saw something going on that wasn't a good fit for our students. So again, I didn't wait for an administrator to say, hey, we're going to change our ESY procedures, because they didn't know it was a problem. We knew it was a problem because we saw the kids every day. So I started that process and I got it pushed through because I got all the teachers on board. We were able to present it to the administrators, and we were also able to use that checklist to collect data so that when we went and said, does the student need services over the summer, we were able to show why they did. So that was something that, again, it was about taking the ownership and taking a leadership role, even though I wasn't an administrator and I wasn't in a position where I was making those decisions from the top down. It started from the bottom, and we simply just decided to do it because we thought it was best for our students. So I wanted to give those specific examples, because sometimes when I say like leadership, go above and beyond, people don't, it helps to have examples. So I wanted to give some specific examples to show that, yes, you can make a difference in the way things are done at your facility. Because in this particular scenario, these students were able to get services that they wouldn't have gotten had I not made some changes in the process of how we did things. And because I was on the committee and because I had started to build those relationships, I was able to persuade enough people that we were able to get things moved through. Now I know that can seem kind of overwhelming, and that is why in the next video I'm going to make, in my next post, I'm going to share how I managed my time so that I was able to make time for things like this. So how I was able to make time to create this, this checklist and do research on what the laws were and meet with teachers so that we could figure out our paperwork. So how I was able to make time for all of those things on top of the other things I was doing serving my caseload. And what I found, I will share with you, is that as I was in the school systems, I actually enjoyed those collaborations with teachers and staff almost as much. And on some days, even more than I did some of my direct therapy planning that I did. So I really started to enjoy that aspect of my job because I saw it making a difference. And really, as an SLP, if we're going to make a big difference, we have to think of ourselves of not just a therapist, and not just someone who does direct therapy with students. Again, that part is super important, but not just a therapist, but also a leader and an advocate who is able to collaborate as a team member with other people, because that is what is going to make a difference in the way that we serve our clients. Because you're going to have a bigger impact on the direct services that you provide with your to your caseload if you do these other things. So I wanted to share those examples today. They were things that I really enjoyed and were really rewarding to me. And I know that if you are willing to look for those opportunities to make those small changes, that things like that will be possible for you as well. So this is actually exactly what I show people how to do in SLP Learning Academy, which is my membership for SLPs that is focused on advocacy for our field. So part of what we do obviously has to do with evidence-based practices and delivering therapy. But if we're going to actually be able to create a situation where we can deliver evidence-based practices, we need to know how to collaborate with the other people that we're working with so that we can get buy-in. Because what you do in therapy is only as effective as the other people who are then taking what you're doing in therapy and reinforcing it, whether it be the teachers, whether it be parents. So in SLP Learning Academy, I give you a core training framework that's going to show you how to manage your schedule and your time so that you can plan specific steps to leadership initiatives and changing protocols and the way that things are done at your facility, like some of those examples that I described today in this video. So in this program, I just give you a complete training library that's going to lay out some specific tools and templates for doing just that for all different kinds of scenarios that might come up as an SLP. And then in addition to that, I not only show you how to manage your schedule and give you some specific examples of protocols that I've done and some common issues that come up as an SLP, like things like response to intervention, handling IEP meetings, how to handle it when you and your administrator don't agree, all kinds of things like that. I talk through all sorts of scenarios, but I also provide Q&A support because you're going to have some unique situations that come up for you in your job. And so that's why I want to be here for you to troubleshoot those specific situations. So I show you how to do all of this in SLP Learning Academy. I will link to that program below so that you can see what it's all about and what you get when you sign up. And so check out that link to learn what's in the program and to learn how to become a member. And then I will be sharing a little bit more about my productivity system in tomorrow's video.